All right, here we go. We're back again with chapter 13 of Strayer, Ways of the World. I'm going to go through this. Part one is a little different. If you see here, I start and I go from pages 575 to 579. And then I jump from 583 to 591. We'll come back and look at China under Mao in one long swoop. And then we'll stop China for a little bit, come back to the collapse of China post-Mao after we do some stuff with decolonization. A lot of stuff in this chapter. If you can see in this picture here, this is celebrating independence in Ghana in 1957 from Great Britain. So this chapter is about the Cold War, the kind of the divergence of the world after World War II between the two superpowers and the sides that you decide to align with, being most countries, either the Soviet Union or the United States in Western Europe. And a lot of countries are also going to get their independence at this time. This is what we call the time of decolonization. And much of Africa and Asia gets its independence and is caught up in the Cold War immediately, as is Latin America and the Middle East, leading to a lot of instability. Big themes in this chapter. We'll run over to Europe real quickly, though, and review some of the stuff we've already covered in class. You'll also cover this a lot next year in U.S. history. So we want to remind ourselves that after the war is over, Europe is divided between East and West, the places that the United States kind of, quote, liberates, and the places that the Soviet Union, quote, liberates. And the Soviet Union under Stalin wants to make sure it has its control over the places its troops come into in Eastern Europe, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and so on, and even Eastern Germany. The United States, of course, wants to make sure that it has its influences in the places it liberates, like France and the Netherlands and so on, and Western Germany. And so we have what Winston Churchill coined the Iron Curtain that divides the two sides. And the United States is going to do things to influence its policy, as is the Soviet Union under Stalin. Okay, so we know the United States also during this time becomes a very powerful economic global superpower, as we say, the strongest economy in the world, grows very rapidly, and is able to flex that economic might through the power of its very modern military. Japan, thanks to a lot of good American investment, becomes a very passive, if you will, and powerful country in terms of its economic might during this time. And then the Soviet Union, as Strayer says, using a convict labor force through the gulags and everything, is also able to move forward to become more industrialized and more powerful, and a nuclear state as well. So here we have the divided map of Europe with the what we call the Eastern Bloc here. And we want to note that this is sort of, actually, I'm going to step back here. This is the European Union. This is not divided Europe. This is more of a united Europe in a more modern sense. So we'll come back to the European Union later, but this is kind of the big story of Western Europe after the end of communism in 1991. Is that Western Europe before that started to unify in something called the European Economic Community, and then that became the European Union in the 1990s, and you see all these states that have kind of joined. And so this is kind of a very solidified European Union, something that the Russian Federation is always kind of wary of, and actually Ukraine's attempts to kind of join the EU is what a lot of people think are part of the reasons why Russia invaded in 2013 and then 2017. So we'll see as we talk more about that. This is sort of the divided world here that I was talking about earlier. So this is a map of the Soviet Union, the United States, and how these different countries had their influences in different places. Always good to remember some countries that are communists, like Yugoslavia, for example, but not under Soviet influence in Europe. Yugoslavia is very unique in that way. Talk about that. And then just want to remember it's not a monolith. Not all the countries that are non-communist agree with the United States. Not all the communist countries agree with each other. There's wars between, like, say, China and Vietnam, and Soviet Union and China kind of have a falling out. So a lot of things happen. Soviet Union has to invade several Eastern Bloc countries at different times. So move on here, talk about the nuclear standoff and third world rivalry. So we want to remind ourselves that, I want to make sure I didn't forget anything here. Sorry, I didn't really prepare this slideshow well because I'm in a hurry today. So I'm going to go through, yes, we'll go back a little bit. Oops, stop that. I want to talk about a couple things. So I guess I did skip a lot on this slide. What am I doing here? Skip this slide here. Okay, so we'll go back to this. My apologies. So we want to remind ourselves that there was a lot of conflict in the Cold War. We talked about things like the United States giving money through the Marshall Plan. The Soviet Union tried something as well for Eastern Europe called the Molotov Plan. It wasn't nearly as powerful, and it didn't really matter. We gave money, about $14 billion, to Western Europe as a way to build up their economies, connect them to us economically, but also to make their people see the benefits of capitalism, see their economy grow so they would not be turned to communism. Because communists, of course, like I've said before, were the big partisan fighters in a lot of Western Europe, therefore not reviled like they are in the United States to the same degree. And people thought, these communists did a lot for us during the war fighting the fascists, maybe we should give them a shot. So there's still a large communist presence in countries like Italy and France, large meaning much bigger than, say, in the United States. To this day, but especially after World War II, they were pretty popular. But the Marshall Plan was very economically successful. A middle class developed, say, in Western Europe, and communism did not seem so appealing to people there. So the Marshall Plan, in a way, worked. We also have the military alliances of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which we know is kind of having a bit of an existential crisis today with the current American administration particularly. But at the time, starting in 1949, is held solid and it's expanded since. Is this alliance, if one nation's attacked, then the others will come to its defense, and it's a way to prevent the Soviet Union from being aggressive, so we thought, if it moved west. So an invasion of West Germany by East German forces or Soviet forces would automatically trigger an American and Western European response. So it kind of maintained a stalemate. Soviet Union then created something called the Warsaw Pact, which is an agreement also with all the Eastern European countries to unite if one of them is attacked. Clearly, the Soviet Union would be the one helping. We also want to remember that there's a spread of communism in other places. In Korea, in North Korea, the Soviet Union occupied North Korea after the Japanese were defeated in World War II, the United States in the South. And when both sides pulled out, the Soviets installed a Korean communist government in the North. The Americans left a non-communist government. It was a dictator, but it wasn't communist. And as soon as we left, the North invaded the South, and then we sent our forces in. And after a 3-year battle, 50,000 Americans, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Koreans killed. They agreed to a stalemate, which still exists to this day. It's just an armistice. There's no treaty, and the two countries, North and South Korea, are still technically enemies. And we still have American forces there, kind of in case there's ever another war, kind of deter any aggression from North Korea. So that's important. In Vietnam, after it got its independence from France after World War II, its major independence leader, their big person who was a nationalist, who was anti-colonialist, was a guy named Ho Chi Minh, and he also was communist, and so he led this communist movement in the North. They basically defeated the French by the 1950s, and the French left, and North Vietnam was communist, the South was not. The United States started sending its military in, and that leads us to the Vietnam War, which will last basically for the Vietnamese from the time of World War II, 1945, all the way to 1975. First, they're fighting the French for independence. They basically kicked the French out in 1954, and then the United States comes in helping South Vietnamese people who don't want to be communists until 1975, when our nation's no longer willing to sacrifice our people, and perhaps 1 million Vietnamese are killed during that war, about 50,000 American soldiers as well. The United States pulls out in 1973, and then in 1975, North Vietnam invades South Vietnam, and the country is united. And now it's a big popular tourist destination for the people from the United States today and around the world. It's a communist-run country, but we do a lot of trade with them now. Like I told you before, I went there in the 90s, right after we opened up, and there's all kinds of, after they opened up, and there's all kinds of capitalist things going on there. I had a friend who started one of the first Adidas shoe factories there in the 90s, a friend from France. So Vietnam, still communist, now very much very close relations with the United States. So we're not so concerned with that so much anymore, as long as you're willing to trade with us in a way that makes us happy. Okay, and then Afghanistan is sort of like the Soviet Union's Vietnam. Vietnam was very divisive for the United States. In Afghanistan, they had a communist country in the 1970s, government I should say, that was under threat. And so the Soviet Union invaded to help that communist government, and we helped those who were against it through sort of the CIA and kind of secret arms deals. And that eventually led to the Soviet Union pulling out. And that really weakened, and this is in the late 1970s, that really weakened the Soviet Union militarily, but also economically, and it really is going to be one thing that people contribute to leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union later. Again, this is another Cold War battle. We're going to look at these later, these proxy wars where Americans are fighting communists or Soviets are fighting non-communists, and both sides is kind of arming the other's enemies, right? But we're not fighting Soviets directly. Cuba is another example where Fidel Castro and Cuban communists are able to overthrow the dictator there, supported by the United States in 1959, establish a communist state. The United States then tries to support a Cuban invasion called the Bay of Pigs, which fails. So then Castro invites the Soviet Union to send some missiles there. They have a missile crisis, Cuban Missile Crisis. This is probably where a lot of people think the world was the closest to nuclear war. That's going to end. And there's basically a stalemate, although we've embargoed Cuba, leading it to being kind of a pariah state for the United States since the 1960s, on and off. And it's been a communist state since. Fidel Castro lived till he died of natural causes, and now turned power over to his brother. And still Cuba's moving along. High literacy, as you read in your book, but lots of poverty. So kind of positives and negatives of communism. Not helpful that it's being embargoed by the United States as well for its development. And, obviously a lot of people fled Cuba. I should say, obviously, when they had the revolution, a lot of middle-class people fled. And they lost all their property in that revolution. So there's a lot of tension related to the history of that communist revolution still today. Again, we'll look at that as an example of a proxy war in class later. Okay, this is the map I went over earlier. We want to remind ourselves that this leads to an arms race. The United States obviously dropped the atomic bombs in Japan in World War II. The Soviet Union very quickly, through espionage and scientific developments, by 1949 had its own bomb. And we developed the hydrogen bomb. There's a photo of it being tested here in 1957 by the United States. It's more powerful, weaponry here, if you will. And losing my adjective there, but at least in an arms race, we build more missiles, they build more missiles, and so on. So there's 60,000 missiles around the world. Different countries are developing their own nuclear capacity. And both sides are courting third world countries once they get their independence. We use that word third world. It's kind of not really commonly used today. Now they use the term developing versus developed world. But anyway, there's this large arms race that's happening. And this is going to happen throughout the Cold War. Okay? So between 1949 and 1989, because of this arms race, we're all thinking that we're all going to die in a massive nuclear war, or Holocaust they call it. When I was your age, I always thought that way. I lived by an Air Force base where they're flying these large B-52 airplanes, in which you had to stop conversations when you were outside with your friends because it was so loud until the jet flew over. And we knew they were all carrying, or at least some of them were carrying, atomic bombs as they flew around, because they can go across the globe, drop them if they need to in various places. And that was just kind of a common Cold War strategy. One of them actually crash landed near my house. It was actually like 10 miles away, but it was so big and powerful it shook the ground. And fortunately, that one was not carrying any atomic weapons. So crazy times in the Cold War for everybody, less for us Americans than other places where the actual war happened. When I was in Vietnam, I studied Vietnamese, and my instructor reminded me all the times that she had to go into the bomb shelter as B-52 planes were bombing, not with nuclear bombs, but with conventional weaponry, Hanoi, where she was living. So a lot of people experienced the Cold War much more ferociously and much more negatively than we did in the United States, but even people in the United States kind of lived under that fear of a nuclear holocaust, which is very palpable, which we somehow are able to shrug off today and kind of pretend like it's not something that we need to worry about, I guess. Okay, so there's Fidel Castro in Cuba. hiding up in the mountains as the revolution is raging before he overthrows Batista, the dictator in Cuba at that time. And then he becomes a dictator himself, but he establishes a communist state. Good to remember. This is what I was talking about before, the East versus the West, and kind of the United States being the leader of the West. The communist state turmoil that Strayer is avoiding to here in this slide is to remember that communist countries have conflict with each other. So the Chinese will invade Vietnam in 1979. Vietnam and the Soviet Union have a falling out in 1960, and all the Soviet advisors are kicked out. Yugoslavia, Joseph Tito has a falling out with Stalin, and he's worried that Stalin's going to try to basically nuke him and assassinate him. So he has this massive bunker built in the side of a mountain. I got to go visit that last summer. Just a reminder that these communists also had conflicts with each other. It wasn't all unity and stuff like that. So keep that in mind. And we'll get to China next. My next one will be probably about China, or I might come back to the next thing we do in class. But this is a good overview of the Cold War that is the first big part of this chapter before we get into decolonization. I will say, I guess I should go back to this. Sorry, I'm jumping around here, but kind of courting. Where is that one? Okay, yeah. So, well, whatever. We're courting kind of what they call third world countries, reminding ourselves some of those countries and where they are. So, the United States is getting involved in Iran. We actually overthrow their leader in the 1950s, which then is going to lead to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, causing Iran to be our enemy still today. We support Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines against communist guerrillas there in the 60s and 70s. We get involved in conflicts in Guatemala. We actually overthrow their government there because it's somewhat tolerant of communists, even though it's not communist. And as well as El Salvador, Chile, we overthrow a leader there. The Congo. We want to remind ourselves the United States and the CIA wasn't always like this angelic country. There were a lot of democracies that we overthrew when we thought they might be open to dealing with the Soviet Union. So the Cold War was serious. There was no messing around. And the biggest goal was to defeat the spread of communism for the United States. So just want to remember to put that in here so you're aware. But we'll talk about that in class. Okay, here we go. I'll talk to you later. All right, bye.